This presentation is Handling Bible Difficulties. Muslims consider the Quran to be a divine document in the sense that it actually exists in heaven, and an accurate copy of it was revealed to Muhammad part by part. Muhammad didn't write any of it down himself, but he had followers around him who recorded what he was saying during his prophetic episodes. They sometimes had to improvise with writing materials, using such things like leaves and rocks, when they didn't have the equivalent of paper. So in a very real sense, their claim is that God dictated the Quran to man. In fact, Muslims say that is the best apologetic for Islam. That is the existence and the perfection of the Quran. Most of the Bible did not come to us like that. There was some direct dictation by God, for instance, the Ten Commandments, but most came from inspired authors. And their human authorship is evidenced in their word choices, grammar, and style. When we say God is the author, what we mean is that the words that the human authors wrote are what God endorses. That leaves a lot of room for individual differences in communication style without compromising the message. Now, since the original authorship of the scriptures was superintended by God, and God cannot err, we claim that the scriptures are without error in the original manuscripts. That is to say, they are inerrant. Everything that the biblical authors proclaim or teach is accurate. That's what inerrant means. A similar but contrasting term is infallible. In other words, not able to fail. When used in a theological sense about the Bible, it means that the Bible will not fail to accomplish its purpose. It does not necessarily mean that the Bible is without error. As a term of art, when someone says the Bible is infallible, they mean that the Bible is completely true in whatever it says regarding matters of faith and practice. That faith and practice part is a key word. In other areas, what the Bible teaches may or may not be completely accurate. So, when the Bible teaches, when the Bible describes God or the way of salvation, it is reliable. However, regarding history, science, geography, and so forth, there is a mixture of truth and error, or there could be. So, to claim that the Bible is inerrant is to claim that the theological and scientific, geographic, and historic details of the scriptural text in their original manuscripts are completely true and without error. This, of course, allows for phenomenological language, such as the sun rising and setting. We all get that. Another way to think of infallibility is to say that we have confidence that the Bible is accurate regarding everything it has to say that is not testable. Now, Horizon University affirms the stronger position that the Bible is not only infallible, but also inerrant. This means that there are some apparent difficulties in the text that we need to come to grips with. Now, I suggest that you go look at the statement of faith of your own church and look for these terms, infallible or inerrant, and see if perhaps they mean the specific technical things that I've just described. If there's any ambiguity, you can ask your pastor or elders. Now, a Bible difficulty. That is an alleged inconsistency, error, or contradiction in the Bible. Now, as an aside here, please notice that the arguments we have marshaled in our case for an historic Jesus and his resurrection from the dead do not rely on an inerrant Bible or even an inerrant New Testament. Understand that, please. We don't need an inerrant Bible to make a reasonable case for Christ. All we need is generally reliable historical documents, the same as for any other events of ancient history. A legal case does not depend on inerrant witnesses, it just needs reliable witnesses. Human testimony will do just fine. So, my strong recommendation is to not debate a skeptic on the subject of inerrancy. It's an interesting in-house discussion among believers. However, with many skeptics, it's only a distracting excuse to not consider the evidence. I think you can safely concede, even temporarily, some of their points. For instance, when they say Matthew mentions only one angel at Jesus' tomb and Luke says there were two, so there's a contradiction. Well, okay, maybe one of them got it wrong. Concede that. for the sake of argument. But putting that detail aside, how about the evidence that there was, in fact, an empty tomb? Concentrate on something like that, not quibbling over issues of inerrancy with a skeptic. Eventually, however, we need to address these apparent difficulties. And I think this is especially true for young believers who care deeply about holding to the truth. It is helpful to begin by addressing the burden of proof issue. The principle of charity is often afforded to all documents. So this is that we presume it to be accurate unless it can be demonstrated otherwise. This is similar to scientific experiments. A scientist doesn't throw away his hypothesis just because of what appears to be an anomaly, something unusual that doesn't fit. He assumes there is an explanation and looks for a way to deal with it. In a similar sense, we have many reasons for confidence in biblical accuracy. When something seems to be contradictory or erroneous, we look for a reasonable solution to the difficulty. So that's the principle of charity. Now, a general approach to handling any Bible difficulty is pretty simple. First thing we do is examine the text and apply our basic principles of hermeneutics. First, know what the text actually says. Look in your margin notes and see if there's an alternate reading. Keep in mind that this is translation from some ancient languages, so translation might not always get everything right, and that's why we have multiple translations. They can be helpful. Look in your margin notes and see if there's an alternate reading. Since what we care about is what the original manuscript says. We want to know what the author intended. Then try to understand what the passage means in its larger context. So, for example, here's one that often comes up. Mark 4:31. Jesus said that the mustard seed is smaller than all the seeds that are upon the soil in the New American Standard. Or NIV says, I think it says the smallest seed you plant in the garden, or another version says the smallest of all seeds. Okay, so that's what's recorded here. Someone has done the measurements and found that the orchid seed is actually smaller than mustard. So, was Jesus wrong? Well, the type of discourse is important, don't you think? He was speaking proverbially, like a proverb. Was Jesus giving a botany lesson? No, he was giving an illustration to farmers. The context was his audience and their experience. So the NIV translation tries to take all of this into account with its version of verse 31, which says, "It is like a mustard seed, which is the smallest seed you plant in the ground." Okay, so there you have an example of something to quibble about, but applying the principle of charity and realizing the context of the audience and what the speaker was really doing, I think it's quite reasonable to see that this is not an error or contradiction at all. Now, skeptics sometimes mention polygamy as being endorsed in the Old Testament and how that is morally inconsistent. Okay, well, there's a lot of bad things described in the Bible. Just read the first several chapters of Genesis. I mean, you get an eyeful there. Just because something is accurately described in the Bible doesn't mean that it is prescribed. Okay, description versus prescription. There may have been cultural reasons for polygamy which God temporarily allowed, but several passages affirm God's design for marriage is one man with one woman. So don't get tripped up there. The Bible records what it doesn't necessarily approve of. Now, here's another one that I just think is laughable, because I've enjoyed seeing how skeptics pounce on 1 Kings 7:23 as an example of error in Scripture, a blatant, provable error. How about that? Well, what is it? It has to do with the description of temple furnishings. So verse 23 says this. He made the sea, which is this big basin, of cast metal, circular in shape, measuring 10 cubits from rim to rim and 5 cubits high. It took a line of 30 cubits to measure around it. Okay, so that's the verse. So there's a big basin described as having a circumference of 30 cubits and a diameter of 10 cubits. Do you see the problem? Well, yes, this is the reason we take math in high school. Since the circumference is pi times the diameter, if the diameter is 10 cubits, the circumference would be what? 31.4 cubits. Actually, 31.4592 cubits, if you want to get more precise. So the Bible is wrong about either the diameter or the circumference. You can't have it both ways. Okay, I hear you. Do you think the Israelites succeeded in actually making this basin? Think about it. Do you think they actually made it? Did it bother them that the dimensions were rounded off? I don't think so. The point of this account was that the basin was huge and required some remarkable engineering and craftsmanship. Read it. Go back and read the whole thing. It wasn't meant to give a geometry lesson. So the type of precision that 21st century Western man is used to, ancient peoples often didn't care. It all depended on the purpose of the numbers. Okay? The purpose. That's another part of the context here. So you can claim an error. Yeah, and that's what they do. They cling to this, but applying the principle of charity and just some common sense lets you accept a more reasonable approach to this. Another thing is that a different perspective is not a different story, and we've seen that in cold case Christianity. Different witnesses, the details are to be expected from different witnesses, and we'll see some examples of that later on in this presentation. So here are some common categories of what we call Bible difficulties. There are different examples of these, but we have the genealogies in Genesis versus the age of the earth. How to reconcile that. The genealogies of Jesus in Matthew and Luke. The extermination of the Canaanites. Is this a moral inconsistency? We have numerical discrepancies. Places in the Bible where the same event is described in two different places, and contradictions are there in the numbers that are used. We have parallel accounts in the Gospels that have some differences among them. And we have Old Testament citations by New Testament authors that don't seem quite accurate in the retelling. So let's look at examples of each. We'll just take them one by one. First of all, the Old Testament genealogies. Okay, this is interesting for nerds. How many of you have actually added these up? Well, obviously I did. It's easy enough to do, and it's kind of fun to see what comes of it. So I don't have everything listed here, but if you add up all of the ages that they say that, Adam lived 130 years and then became the father of Seth, and Seth lived 105 years and became the honor of the father of Enosh, etc. If you take everything at face value, all those ages add up to 1,556 years up through Noah. And then after the flood, you have another set of generations listed like that, which adds up to 390 years. They didn't have room to show it all in here. Wasn't necessary. So from Adam to Abraham was 1,946 years. Abraham lived approximately 2000 BC. And, starting from there, and especially once you get into King David and the kingdom period, there are ways of correlating some of those events with other things that happened in ancient history, and we can correlate with actual dates in our Gregorian calendar. So This arithmetic, I mean, just think about it. If you do all the arithmetic and you take it at face value, I mean, you can calculate when the earth actually came into existence. So it led Irish Bishop James Ussher, who died in 1656, to conclude that the creation event had occurred in 4004 BC. So this is the Bishop Ussher date that you'll often see, and especially among skeptics. They like, holding this up and saying, you Christians, you claim that the whole universe was created in 4004 BC, and some do, and the reason they do is because of adding up, doing the arithmetic, adding up all these numbers. Now, in recent decades, this has prompted some ridicule, since abundant evidence from astronomy, geology, and genetics all seem to confer a more ancient age for the universe and a longer history for humans on the Earth. So, how do we reconcile the observed data with biblical revelation? Now, I'm not going to get into all the scientific reasons for thinking that the Earth is old right here, other than to say that there are at least those three converging lines of evidence from what did I say? Astronomy, geology, and genetics. There's in geology, there's also analyzing ice cores from Greenland and so forth, where you can actually count the number of winter seasons that go by, that end up being more than 100,000, I think, is one of the papers that I read one time. So it seems like there's good reason to think that the Earth is older than 4004 BC, or 6,000 years, now. And even the young Earth creationists, who hold that the Earth is young and not billions of years old or even hundreds of thousands of years old, they would concede the following point, and that is that there may be gaps in the genealogical record. The Ken Ham in Answers for Genesis, I think that they concede they'll go as far as 10,000, maybe 20,000 years old for the Earth, accepting the fact that there may be gaps. And an accurate reading of an understanding of the Hebrew, as well as a comparison of passages, will show this. So the biblical genealogies were not usually intended to provide correlation to dates. That isn't what they're there for. And since the Hebrew word for father of can also mean ancestor of, the individuals mentioned in the text may simply be touch points along a timeline. So let's assume that it's possible that there can be gaps in the genealogical record just because of the meaning of the Hebrew words. And in fact, we have evidence of such gaps when we compare, for instance, Matthew 1:8 with 1 Chronicles 3, 10 through 12. Matthew reads, it's portions of genealogies. So Matthew reads, Asa the father of Jehoshaphat, and Jehoshaphat the father of Jehoram, and Jehoram the father of Uzziah. However, 1 Chronicles 3, 10 through 12 reads it differently. It says Asa, his son, Jehoshaphat, his son. Okay, Jehoram, his son. Okay, so far so good. Ahaziah, his son, Joash, his son, Amaziah, his son, and Azariah, who has an alternate name. He's also known as Uzziah, his son. So Matthew left out 3 generations: Ahaziah, Joash, and Amaziah. Why did he do that? Well, he had obviously a different purpose than to give us precise and exhaustive genealogy. One of the things that Matthew said is that he grouped things in 14s. He had his own reasons for doing this grouping and for listing the genealogies. The point is that it didn't bother him at all to leave out 3 generations of people. Didn't bother him at all. How about Luke's genealogy of Jesus? Well, in Luke 3, he adds Canaan between Arphaxad and Shelah, and compare it with Genesis 11. So there are just two examples comparing New Testament with Old Testament of gaps in genealogies that are presented. There is one of the articles that I have listed for you to read goes into a lot more detail, just looking at the Genesis genealogies and other Old Testament genealogies, making the argument that there are gaps there. Or at a minimum, we can't know whether there are or not. And so we have to allow for that possibility. So the point is here that we must admit to some ambiguity in translating the word for father of. And also we cannot just simply impose our 21st century Western expectations on the biblical text. You know, how we want things to be is very precise and orderly and exhaustive. I mean, that's how we do genealogies, right? You know, we want to get things all lined up and adding up and so forth. Well, they didn't care about that stuff as much back in the olden days. They had a different purpose for doing things. So that's how we can deal with the apparent discrepancy between the genealogies and what we observe in our natural world. So as long as we're looking at genealogies, and we already mentioned Matthew and Luke, let's take a little closer look at Matthew and Luke. Here's another thing that is raised as contradictions and discrepancies in the biblical text. I'm sure you've all read the genealogies in Matthew and Luke, or at least pretended to read them. They're different. There is a radical difference in the lineage provided by Matthew, and that's applied by Luke. And we're not talking about gaps here, but they're entirely different lists of names. Now, Matthew starts with Abraham and goes forward in time, whereas Luke begins with Jesus and traces backwards. Okay, that's not what we're talking about. It's in the list of names. If they were the same, you can go backwards or forwards, you should get the same list of names, right? Well, there's a discrepancy that's immediately noticeable. They have different lists between the time of David and Jesus during those centuries. Now, the first thing we should ask is this. Okay, just put your thinking cap on for a moment. Did anyone in the first century see this? What do you think? Here you have, the end of the first century. Matthew had his gospel. Luke had his, let's say, already circulating around. Do you think anyone in the first century held them next to each other and said, wait a minute, these are different. What do we got going here? Wasn't this so-called contradiction troublesome to anyone, especially since the Jews were pretty meticulous about this kind of record keeping? No, they took genealogies pretty seriously. You got inheritance issues, tribal issues, marriage issues. They took genealogies seriously. They weren't going to let these things slide. Apparently, nobody thought that it was that big of a deal. We don't see any attempts to be reconciling these things, saying one of them was wrong or not. So here's the quick answer, without going into a whole lot of analysis. The solution is that Matthew has provided us with Jesus' legal lineage through Joseph, and Luke has given us his biological lineage through Mary. Both of them converge with King David, and that's the point. The point made by both of them is that Jesus has rightful claim to his throne as the son of David, no matter which way you consider him. Okay, now the Jews were much more concerned with the legal aspects of inheritance. And Luke, who was writing for Gentiles, may have been more concerned with the the biological, the physical, um, lineage. But either way, take it either way, you get to David. And so Jesus is the son of David in many different ways. Okay, well, that seems plausible. Okay, I mean, that would explain a lot. But then you take a closer look at Luke 23 and you say, well, wait a minute. Here's how it reads. It says, he, meaning Jesus, was the son, so it was thought, of Joseph, the son of Heli, the son of Matthat, etc. Now, doesn't this say it is describing Jesus' ancestry through Joseph? Now, of course, it has the language being supposedly the son of Joseph. Okay, well, we got the virgin birth thrown in there. But it seems to be saying that Joseph was the son of Heli, or Heli. I don't know how you pronounce these things. Okay, consider this, though. The Greek text, I'm told, does not use the word son after the son of, well, I did look this up. The Greek text does not use the word son after the son of Joseph. So it literally reads, supposedly the son of Joseph, of Heli, of Matthat. Okay, so that son of Greek word doesn't appear along with Heli and Matthat and the rest of those words. Okay, that's interesting. There is also no Greek word for son-in-law. That's what I'm told. Joseph was called of Heli by marriage to Mary. So Heli's daughter. Mary is Heli's daughter. That's the way this argument goes. Now, I'll have to defer to the Greek scholars who say that son-in-law is a valid substitute for that blank area when Joseph is called the of Heli. It seems reasonable that it could be read that way, and that's what I'm told by Greek scholars, is that it very naturally can be understood as Joseph being the son-in-law of Heli. Now, enough on that. You can talk to your Greek professor. Ask him about that. Now, here's a fun one. In Deuteronomy 20:16, the Israelites are told, "In the cities of the nations the Lord your God is giving to you as an inheritance, do not leave alive anything that breathes. Completely destroy them. The Hittites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, as the Lord your God has commanded you." That's pretty bleak. Our moral sensibilities are finely tuned nowadays to abhor anything that smacks of racism or ethnic cleansing, and that's what this looks like. You have God appearing to command his people to commit genocide. Now, how can a good God do such a thing? There's a title of a book, Is God a Moral Monster? I've forgotten the guy's name right now. Should know him. He's pretty prominent in these circles, but that's what the accusation is the Old Testament God is a moral monster, and here's the evidence of it. Okay, step back, calm down. Let's think through clearly on this. First, let's remember whom we are talking about. We're talking about God. This is the creator of mankind, the creator of the world. Okay, we may not have the moral right to take human life, but God does. Just like an artist has the right to destroy his own works of art, right? So someone else has said that we don't have the right to play God with someone's life. Okay, yeah, that's right. We don't have the right to play God, but God has the right to play God. Okay, so that's kind of a fundamental principle. Now, that doesn't deal with everything here. But it is good to remind ourselves that that God has some prerogatives that we don't. So we can't just impose our own human moral sensibilities on him. All right, so that's thing one. Next, observe. Look carefully at this. The action that God commanded of the Israelites has nothing to do with race or ethnicity. You may need to read the larger context in here of Deuteronomy, but it's not ethnic cleansing. Instead, it was more of a religious cleansing, similar to the political cleansing that does away with all opposition to a sovereign. So those who are willing to submit to Israel's God were welcome to join the community. I mean, you can see this in the same passage, in that same context, larger context. So it's not ethnic cleansing. It's ideological cleansing. We should all also ask for the reason why God ordered the destruction of the Amalekites or the other Canaanite peoples. And he tells us a couple of verses later, and here it is. He says, "Do this, otherwise they will teach you to follow all the detestable things they do in worshiping their gods, and you will sin against the Lord your God." Okay. So it isn't just that he's mean or doesn't like them or something. He says there's a good reason for this kind of ideological cleansing. He says, otherwise they will teach you to follow all the detestable things they do in worshiping their gods, and you will sin against the Lord your God. So there's something bigger going on here. God's master plan, keep in mind, was to save the world. I mean, this is back from the Abrahamic covenant, where it's explicitly described. You could say that it even goes back to Genesis 3. But certainly from Abraham. And to do that, to save the world, he chose a people that were to be kept separate and distinct from the surrounding nations. They needed to be isolated and protected from corrupting influences. And that's largely what the law was for, right? But driving out the occupants of the land of promise was also essential. They needed to be kept physically separate. And of course, they didn't do that completely, and we see what some of the consequences were. And we get a glimpse of what some of those dire consequences might otherwise have been by considering Saul's disobedience. Okay, here's just one example. Remember Saul? He was ordered by God through Samuel, to completely destroy the Amalekites as God's judgment on them. Instead, I mean, he sort of did it, but he preserved some of the best stuff and people, including their king Agag, for himself. Agag ultimately did not survive. Okay, Samuel corrected things. But if it were up to Saul, he would have. But obviously some of Agag's family did survive, because we read in Esther, chapter 3, verse 1, that Haman, remember Haman? The man who nearly wiped out the Israelites in Persian exile? He was a descendant of Agag. Think about that for a while. The close call that the Israelites had in Persia of being completely exterminated was at the hand of a descendant of someone who Saul was commanded to completely wipe out, him and all of his descendants and all of his family. And that obviously didn't happen. And so here's one of the consequences. So these things have ramifications that you can't see at the time. So God's just judgment on those nations was another good reason for their destruction. So we have multiple reasons here. We are even given a list of their egregious practices in Leviticus 18, from every kind of sexual deviancy to human sacrifices. I'm not going to read Leviticus 18 now, but you can go yourself and take a look at that. They're listed as reasons for their destruction, God's judgment. And the Israelites were warned that the same fate would come to them if they did the same things. Think about that. So it isn't ethnic cleansing because, we're better and God doesn't like you. The Israelites were warned that the same fate would befall them if they fell into the same practices. And in fact, God did judge Israel for their idolatry and other sins, using the surrounding nations to attack them. So he followed through on that promise. God didn't play favorites over race. One of the things that is misunderstood about this chosen people thing, the Israelites being God's chosen people doesn't mean that they're God's favorites in the sense that, two brothers, well, mom always liked you more, that kind of a thing. The nation of Israel being selected was for a purpose. And God's blessing was on them, but also his cursing was on them. I mean, that it was all wound up, tied up in the purpose that he was using them for. So he selected a people in order to accomplish something, not because he was playing favorites with them. And the purpose, keep in mind, from the Abrahamic covenant was to bless all the nations of the world. And ultimately that was, accomplished. So the Gentiles were grafted in, so to speak, to the promise. And that was the intention all along. Oh, I remembered who it was that wrote that book, Is God a Moral Monster? It's Paul Copan, C-O-P-A-N. And he had some interesting ideas about why it was commanded by God that the Israelites should sometimes destroy everything. In other words, the men, women, children, and animals. This was the case with the Amalekites. He just pointed out that list of abominations in Leviticus 18, every kind of sexual deviancy was in there, including sex with animals. And so he was, just thinking about that and saying, when that kind of thing occurs, it corrupts the animal and it's no longer suitable for, living with humans, domesticated use. So the practices of the people, according to Copan, so defiled and ruined not only the people and the culture, but also the animals, the children, everything, and it just needed to all be destroyed, wiped clean, started over again. Interesting idea. At a minimum, we know that God had good moral justification for commanding what he did, even if we don't know what it was or can understand it all. Numerical discrepancies. There are several of these. Remember that it's only the autographs, the original writings, that we consider to be inspired or inerrant, not the copies. So, sometimes the numbers are different in parallel accounts of the exact same event. And in Kings and Chronicles, we have two different accounts of the same events from different perspectives. And often they're described differently. Sometimes the numbers are different. And here's an example, classic example, it's always brought up. It says, David defeated, well, you can read this yourself. So how many horsemen were there? Were there 1,700 horsemen and 20,000 foot soldiers? Or were there 7,000 horsemen and 20,000 foot soldiers? That is a blatant discrepancy. It cannot both be right. At least one of them has to be an error. Well, was it an error by the original author? We don't know, but probably not. Keep in mind that um, Hebrew used Hebrew letters, the alphabet, in order to write their numbers, their numerals. And there was some ambiguity sometimes in that. Now, I don't know Hebrew, so I'm just reporting what I've been told. That it is easy to get it wrong in copying or in interpreting. So let's just look at it that way. Textual critics have fun trying to determine which reading is correct based on theories of how a copying mistake may have occurred. I'm not sure that it matters very much in this case. I think we can assume that somebody made a mistake in copying. And since the oldest manuscripts we had nowadays are the Dead Sea Scrolls, that's still a 1,000-year gap, at least hundreds of years of a gap to the original writing. And assuming that maybe Ezra put one of these together, but a copyist mistake is very reasonable. Look at the next one: parallel accounts in the Gospels. This is the kind of thing that I see is the first one to be objected to, by people that claim that there's some kind of error or contradiction in the Bible, in the New Testament. Let's look at them. I have three types of things listed here. Different parallel accounts. And there are parallel accounts in the New Testament. We'll just take the Synoptic Gospels. That you've been told many times, I'm sure, that Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called synoptic because they see things together. Syn together, optic, see. So they see things, from together. They have a lot of parallels with each other. But they contradict each other, or they don't say the same things. The accusation is they contradict each other. Well, let's start by defining what a contradiction is. It's a very precise thing. A contradiction is something that violates the law of non-contradiction. Okay, so here it is from logic. From the critical thinking class. The law of non-contradiction states that A meaning something, A cannot equal non-A at the same time and in the same sense. For an example, it is impossible for you to be both viewing this PowerPoint and not viewing this PowerPoint at the same time and in the same sense. So what if you tell me this? I am viewing the PowerPoint and I am also watching TV at the same time. Is that a contradiction? No, you could be doing both things simultaneously, though I would say doing them not very well, and I strongly encourage you to turn off the television right now. I'll wait. You didn't say, I am viewing the PowerPoint and not viewing the PowerPoint at the same time. If you had, that would be a contradiction. Get it? Okay. So, A and non-A at the same time and in the same sense. That's what a contradiction is. Now, we are ready to look at these troublesome passages. Matthew 20:29 recounts a story in which Jesus heals two blind men. Yeah, that's what Matthew says. He says there are two blind men. What appear to be the exact occasion is described in Mark 10 and Luke 18, and they only say there was one blind man. At least only one is mentioned. Mark even tells us the man's name, Bartimaeus. Now, is that a contradiction? Well, question, is it possible that all three could be telling the truth? Well, sure it is. There were two blind men who were healed by Jesus, but one of them was more prominent than the other. He was the one making noise. He was the spokesman. He's the one whose name people knew. The point made by Mark and Luke is that Jesus did this remarkable healing. Their point was not in giving a thorough list of everyone who was there. In fact, they may have thought it distracted from their story to talk about the other blind man who was sort of along for the ride. Matthew, evidently, obviously, didn't. He said there were two blind men. Now, in a similar fashion, when recounting the healing of the demon-possessed man at Gadara, Matthew says there were two such men. Mark and Luke only mention one. The same kind of thing. I think the same principle applies here. The teller of the story has a purpose, and they are crafting their account of the story for the effect that they are looking for. Matthew obviously said there were two demon-possessed men because that told the story the way that he wanted. Mark and Luke were different. And they give a little more information about, a conversation that Jesus had with the man. Okay, last one here. How many angels were at Jesus' tomb? Well, in this case, Matthew and Mark both mention one angel. And Luke, and now we'll pull John in too, because he talks about this situation. Luke and John say there are two angels. Now, who's right? Well, you already see that they can all be right. Additional information does not make a contradiction. Okay? Principle of charity. Just like witnesses at a crime scene or witnesses to an automobile accident. Different details are brought in, different particulars. It doesn't mean that there's a contradiction. You put them all together. All right. Now, the final example I have is one that actually really concerned me in my younger days. It concerned me enough to ask my pastor about it. And fortunately, he had enough knowledge to give me a reasonable answer. Otherwise, I would have been, I don't know, stewing about it for weeks. So I had been in the habit of reading my Bible with a desire to see how things fit together. I just have a need for things to make sense. So in the New Testament, when I encountered a quotation from the Old Testament, I would look it up. And a Bible with a cross-reference really helps with this. Sometimes the quote wasn't quite the same as the reference, which didn't bother me because, I realized there were two different languages involved. So if you're doing a translation, we have an English translation from a Greek translation of a Hebrew passage. Okay, two translations. You're not going to get the same wording as the Hebrew translation into English. All right, I get that. Not a problem. And I also knew there were no quotation marks in the original languages. All right, so in the Greek New Testament, when something is shown as a quotation in our English Bible, the Greek author, Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, they may not have regarded it as a quotation, and their intention may not have been to transmit word for word. It could be a paraphrase rather than a word-for-word quotation. If they were quoting, it was probably from the Septuagint, which is, of course, the Greek translation of the Old Testament. And sometimes it is, but other times it's not. And sometimes the New Testament author would say where the quote could be found, and sometimes they didn't. Well, that was the part that bothered me. When the New Testament author would say that where the quote could be found, And in actuality, it seemed like it was actually someplace else, someplace completely different. Now, I admit this is kind of an obscure thing, but it's what bothered me. So here's an example. Let's start with the one from Matthew, Matthew 27, 9 through 10. So here's what it says. Then that which was spoken through Jeremiah the prophet was fulfilled, saying, quote, and they took the 30 pieces of silver, the price of the one whose price they had been set by the sons of Israel, and they gave them for the potter's field, as the Lord directed me. Okay, unquote. So that's what Matthew quotes. Of course, it's in the context of talking about Judas and how Judas fulfilled prophecy. And he says Jeremiah was the prophet that spoke about this. Now in Jeremiah, there is something similar. Okay? It reads this way. This is what the Lord says. This is from Jeremiah 19, verses 1 through 4. This is what the Lord says. Go and buy a clay jar from a potter. Take along some of the elders of the people and the priests and go out to the valley of Ben Hinnom, near the entrance of the potsherd gate, and there proclaim the words I tell you and say, hear the word of the Lord, O kings of Judah and people of Israel. This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says. Listen, I am going to bring a disaster on this place, and will make the ears of everyone who hears it tingle. And it goes on and on. Now, the only thing about that that's similar is the reference to potter. Go buy a clay jar from the potter. But in my cross-reference, that's the Jeremiah passage it points to. However, in Zechariah, chapter 11, verses 12 through 13, we read this. That's what it says in Zechariah. I told them, if you think it best, give me my pay, but if not, keep it. So they paid me 30 pieces of silver, and the Lord said to me, throw it to the potter, the handsome price at which they priced me. So I took the 30 pieces of silver and threw them into the house of the Lord to the potter. Now, doesn't that seem closer to what Matthew was referring to? I mean, it has a number of parallel touch points to the account of Judas receiving 30 pieces of silver, throwing it into the temple, buying the potter's field, and so forth. And there are a few others like this. So, error. Now, Matthew said it's Jeremiah. It's actually in Zechariah. I mean, let's be honest about this. That Jeremiah passage, that's a bit of a stretch to say that Matthew was quoting Jeremiah. He was clearly quoting Zechariah. So how do I explain this kind of error? This is what bothered me. Well, here's what my pastor told me. He said this. He said the major prophets, like Jeremiah and Isaiah, were called major because they had more to say. Their scrolls were bigger. And it was common practice to bundle some of the writings of the minor prophets with one of the majors. So, saying the prophet Jeremiah was a way to refer to the collection that included the writings of both Jeremiah and Zechariah. Well, okay. I mean, that could be. Sort of makes sense. I've also heard that the minor prophets were kind of all bundled together. All their writings maybe in one scroll or separate scrolls all bundled together. I don't know how they're bundled, but it's a reasonable explanation. Not completely satisfying to me. Here's another possibility. That while Zechariah has more direct reference in Matthew, this Jeremiah passage also has something to do with it, even if not very much. And Matthew is combining and summarizing from both of those sources. Well, okay, I think you have to look beyond that reference to the potter in Jeremiah in order to kind of gather this up. And since Jeremiah is the more prominent writer, the quote is attributed to him. All right, that could be too. This gets back to the imprecision issue. What was Matthew's point? I think his point is that this is a fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. That what happened with Judas is something that had been foretold by the prophets. Jeremiah is certainly the most prominent of the prophets. Well, Isaiah and Jeremiah, and if there's any inkling of his association with with Zechariah and his what he wrote in there, it would make sense that he would mention Jeremiah and not Jeremiah and Zechariah. I mean, he would just say the one. So the precision is not what we want, but it's the way they wrote. It's what he cared about. It's better than saying somewhere someone wrote. Okay, he at least provides a little bit of attribution. Now, something similar happens in Mark chapter 1, which actually combines a quotation from Malachi 3:1 and Isaiah 43. It was a common literary practice in those days to mention only the more famous of the prophets. We would have wanted separate footnotes. I get it. But remember, we cannot impose our modern Western standards of journalism on the ancient authors. Okay? Now, two books that I have found helpful listed here. The Encyclopedia of Bible Difficulties by the renowned Hebrew scholar Gleason Archer, who I actually met one time at a conference. I forget when it was, at least 10 years or more ago. He's passed on now, but I met him in the men's restroom. I won't go into detail, but he was a remarkable individual, and he has a book called The Encyclopedia of Bible Difficulties. And Norman Geisler, who I also met, I picked him up at the airport. And no, not the airport. I picked him up at a hotel and drove him to a conference that he was speaking at and got to spend some car time with him. So Gleason Archer and Professor Thomas Howe wrote When Critics Ask. Those two books have a list of alleged Bible difficulties and contradictions and some of the more common ways of dealing with these. And they're pretty thick books, so there's a lot of these. Now, one of your assignments is to actually look at some of the skeptic websites, and they're fun to look at to see what some of the Bible contradictions and errors are that the skeptics, the atheists and non-Christians seize on as evidence that the Bible is wrong and can be dismissed without any further attention. So I think you'll enjoy taking a look at those, and you have an assignment that is meant to get you into it and have some practice responding to those. So enjoy.